Hello and welcome back. Today we are diving into two kingdoms. We're going to talk about Protista and fungi. You might be a little bit more familiar with fungi, but I think Protista is going to be brand new to just about everyone. So we're just going to do a quick overview of both and introduce you to the characteristics that distinguish these organisms into these specific kingdoms. So to start, we're gonna go over just like an overview of protists. Let's talk about like all protists have this, right? So they are all eukaryotic. And what that means is that every single protist has a nucleus. That's the big difference between eukaryotic and prokaryotic, right? But all protists have a nucleus, but there's a huge range of size and structure, bigger than any other kingdom that we're gonna talk about. You can see in the image at the bottom, all of these are considered protists, but they look so different from each other. That's just part of being in this kingdom. They can be heterotrophs or autotrophs. They can be unicellular or multicellular, and they can reproduce asexually or sexually. They're sort of all over the place. The only thing that is like for sure everyone has is a nucleus, which is why that one's a little bit bigger, right? Eukaryotic is bigger. Protists can also be animal-like, plant-like, or fungus-like. They are literally all over the place. They're super cool, but let's talk a little bit more about them. Let's dive a little bit further. They have really interesting ways that they can move and ways that they can reproduce, right? We talked about that they can reproduce asexually or sexually, and we're going to talk about how they do that. But first, let's talk about movement. So there are three different ways that they can move: with cilia, with flagella, or with pseudopods. So cilia is like this first picture, these like little tiny short hairs that go all the way around it, and they sort of just like wiggle in a liquid, the hairs, and they'll like slowly like move them along by like wiggling through. It's like kind of like swimming just with like just your fingers maybe, right? Just swimming with little tiny hairs. The flagella is the one at the end, right, with this long whip-like projection. And so that whip-like projection works like almost like a shark tail, where it like swims back and forth and it can like really propel them through a liquid. And then a pseudopod is a projection of cytoplasm. It's temporary, so they don't always have, these specific pseudopods, but they can kind of like move along with these projections that are now like outside of their core body. What's cool about pseudopods is because they're temporary, this organism constantly changes shape, which I think is interesting. And then for reproduction, asexually, they just split into two identical cells. We call that binary fission. It's a type of asexual reproduction. And then sexual reproduction is the same as what you're thinking like that animals go through. You fuse haploid gametes together. It increases genetic diversity. This is the same thing that we were talking about with meiosis earlier in the year. And then finally, just some types of protists. So I said there was animal, plant, and fungi-like protists. And so for animal-like protists, they're all heterotrophic, which makes sense because animals are heterotrophic. They need to consume other organisms to get energy. That makes sense. Whereas plant-like protists, they're all autotrophic, and they have chloroplasts, and they have chlorophyll because they go through photosynthesis to get energy, which makes sense because plants do that. Now, plankton, I know you've heard of plankton because I know that you guys have seen SpongeBob in your life, right? You know plankton in that show. But plankton in the real world is just a small floating organism in various aquatic environments, whether it's freshwater, whether it's saltwater, aquatic environments. There's two types of plankton though. There's zooplankton and there's phytoplankton. Zooplankton are heterotrophic, they're like animals. They're more animal-like, and phytoplankton are more plant-like, they're autotrophic, and phytoplankton are actually the largest producer on Earth, which is a fun fact, honestly. And then fungi-like. Fungi-like is the last type, and fungi are heterotrophic. They are decomposers that absorb nutrients from dead or decaying organic matter, and we've talked about decomposers before, but fungi, and therefore fungi-like protists, are considered heterotrophic because they absorb their nutrients. They do not have chloroplast. They do not go through photosynthesis. They have to consume really dead matter to get their nutrients. Okay, so that is like your overview of protists. Now we're going to switch gears here and we're going to dive into fungi. I'm sure you've seen mushrooms in your life in the grocery store, out on your nature walks, wherever they are. So let's do an overview just like we did with protists. All fungi are eukaryotic, and all of the fungi have a cell wall that's made of chitin. That's pronounced chitin with like a hard CH. This is the same thing that's found in the exoskeletons of insects. You know when you like step on a bug and it makes that like crunchy sound? That's you breaking the chitin. And so the cell wall in fungi is also made of that same carbohydrate. They are all heterotrophs, and they're all decomposers, right? Which is what we just talked about. And they are mostly multicellular. There are a few that are unicellular, like yeast, but I would say the majority are multicellular. Now, we're going to learn 2 new vocab words just because fungi are interesting. So, fungi are made up of a ton of thin filaments, and those thin filaments are called hyphae. Hyphae, right? These, like, all these, like, little tiny lines are called hyphae. And they're 1 cell thick, but they're, like, really long. They're, like, really, really long noodles of spaghetti, right? They're super thin, but they're so long. And when you like mush all of these hyphae together and you tangle them up and you make this like thick mass that then looks like a mushroom, that is called mycelium. So all of the hyphae mushed together to make this beautiful looking mushroom, we would then call all of that mass mycelium. But if we were looking at one specific cell or one specific like noodle in this mycelium, we would call that hyphae. So that's the difference between those two. And reproduction. They can reproduce sexually or asexually as well. Pretty common is sexually by using spores. They're reproductive cells that are released from the gills, which is like the underside of a mushroom. Like it would be found like under the cap of the mushroom. And they're spores, and they're released, you know, from wind or water or animals or whatever it may be. And those spores land in the dirt, and then they can germinate, and then they'll grow their own mycelium. And, you know, they'll meet up with another spore, sexual union, and then they continue to make new fungi. That would be sexual reproduction. However, those spores can also germinate and just, or break off a hyphae from the original fungi and just grow on their own, and, you know, they can create clones from these cells, and this would just be asexual fruiting. So they can reproduce both sexually and asexually, which is pretty interesting. And then types of fungi, we're just going to kind of talk briefly about these 2 types. Well, there's lots of useful fungi, and you probably are more familiar with the useful fungi, but there are negative, unhelpful fungi. They're heterotrophic parasites. So these are things that feed and harm other living organisms. And they affect humans. Yeast infections, athlete's foot, both of these things are fungi, and they both affect humans, but they're heterotrophic parasites. But on the flip side of that, there's tons of useful fungi. There's fungi that can produce antibiotics, like penicillin, fungi that makes cheese, like blue cheese, which is personally my favorite cheese, Roquefort, Gorgonzola, tons of, I love cheese, so many good cheeses. You can also use yeast, which is a fungi, right? You can use yeast to make bread, wine, beer. Fungi can be used in a multitude of ways for eating and for medicine and there's other ways, but these are the ways that we're going to focus on in class. So fungi can be really good, but can also cause pretty horrible diseases as well. So That's it for today. That's our coverage on 2 kingdoms that you might be less familiar with. We're going to dive into some other kingdoms next time, but great job. Super proud of you, and I'll see you in class.